Okay. So, for one thing, let me just address real quick kind of the thing that we haven't been uploading weekly. Ice Storm that we had aside, we've just kind of been in a weird spot. On the one hand, God's been kind of taking us through some things where we've been needing to like grow and expand. Like I myself have been needing to grow and expand. And it's not really a place where one teaches from, or at least it hasn't been. Not in this occasion, anyways. There's also just been the reality that, like, since I switched jobs, Wednesday nights have gotten a lot harder to work with. I mean, nights in general have gotten a lot harder to work with. And then, as if that wasn't enough, we don't really have a location to meet at. So, we've kind of been trying to figure that out. For now, it's just recordings, and hopefully, I'll be a little bit better about doing those when especially when like God's like, hey, do this thing, and I'm like, okay, I should do this, and then it gets neglected. Because truth be told, this message was supposed to be done like a week ago or two. So, and unfortunately, like if there's anybody who understands timing and how much of a problem that can be, I dearly hope that this message didn't miss somebody who needed it. Because I personally have been in that boat before where I needed a message, a word, and the person neglected to do it. And lo and behold, they came and delivered to me after the fact when God had finally already talked to me about it. And I just looked at them, I'm like, I needed that. I needed that word. So yeah, hopefully we're not doing that. Now all that said, announcements out of the way. Tonight's message is one of those ones. It's one of those ones that we're meant to hold on to all the time. Peace is something that in this world, in our particular lifestyle, in American culture, is very fleeting. Oftentimes, it's not even valued. The truth of the matter is that many of us, we seek tranquility, but we struggle with peace. See, it's important to understand that tranquility is a state of, things kind of being comfortable, gentle, placid. Peace is, well, let put it this way. Tranquility is on the outside. You put yourself in a state of tranquility by surrounding yourself with a peaceful environment. Peace, though, peace comes from the inside. When God talks about peace, when peace is talked about in the Bible, over and over and over again, it is a state of being that comes from the eternal, or from the internal. Now, the thing about it is that, like, that's not always easy to do. The reality is that we have so many occasions where we're pulled and pushed and drawn in so many different directions. Who of us doesn't know some level of calamity on a routine basis? When I look at the people from our group, a lot of people have like a tumultuous characteristic. And that's kind of the thing, is that there's a lot of chaos out there, and there's a lot of chaos in the people in the church. And there's a question of how do we proceed forward? How do we find peace? How do we acquire it in the midst of so much bad? And that's the thing, just to kind of like briefly cover this thing, what makes peace so hard varies from person to person. Sometimes it's just life circumstance. I sometimes it is just the fact that like everything's difficult. Your finances are struggling, your job is difficult, your job is taxing, your job has you in contact with difficult customers, you have people breathing down your neck, maybe maybe it's bosses, your mother-in-law is routinely cursing you, or your mom poisons you every week. Uh, have lived that one. You know, the thing about it is that there's a lot of stuff, and I put kind of a funny anecdote, but realistically, there's a lot of us who struggle with peace because of trauma, because of things that are on our insides. Maybe it's not the external pressing in and demanding all of your attention. Sometimes it's the internal. Sometimes you can't find peace because you've got PTSD. You know what? I always remember this friend of mine back in the day. He was a former. He had started off in the Marines, and then he became a sergeant in the army. And when he came back from Iraq and Afghanistan and everything, he was trying to adjust to life as a Christian. And he had a good heart, but the man had such a struggle with life. I have infamously been like somebody who doesn't sleep very much. But I would see him up all night long, through like Facebook Messenger when it shows you that they're active. I would see this man up all the time, and he'd post stuff about what was going on with him. About how he just couldn't sleep. He felt restless. He decided he needed to go do some work, so he went outside and he chopped wood for 6 hours. And now he had all this wood he didn't know what to do with, so he was offering it to people, and he'd drive it over to them, and he'd even stack it for them because it gave him something to do. I think about this, and I also think about a person I went to high school with. There was a guy, oh man, his name escapes me now, which is crazy. Lawrence. Lawrence was his first name. Can't remember his last name though. Lawrence got bagged for treason. So he joined the army, and he was highly commended. He basically joined the army right out of high school. He was inspired by the events of 9/11, which happened he was in my same grade. He was in I went to middle school with him. But he struggled, like after 9/11, a lot of people were kind of like heading towards the military. And Lawrence was one of those people, and he did fantastic. Highly commended soldier. But the problem that occurred was that when the time came for him when his term was over, he did his 3-4 years, however long he signed up for. He was restless and he couldn't stop. He needed the training. The way he described it in the article I read, is that he felt like he needed the training. He needed that something to do. So he went and he did it. And he joined the French Foreign Legion. And he fought in the French Foreign Legion for years and years and years. And he was a model soldier for the French Foreign Legion. And then he came back to the US, home, and he was immediately arrested and tried for treason, because that's what happens when you're a national and you sign up for the military and then you join a foreign nation's military, even as a mercenary, especially as a mercenary. Now, I don't know if he ever actually, I don't know if he got out of it or not. To my understanding, he didn't. But I bring up these stories of these individuals from who are former military, because it's easy to see in these stories like what one thing about them and the struggle that we all have. When you have trauma, when you have PTSD, a lot of times you will find yourself struggling with the concept of peace because you can't grab it. What you need, what you find yourself needing, what you find yourself gravitating towards, is anything that you can do. Because if you're doing something, you're not left with those feelings that you don't have any control over. And that is so much worse than burnout in so many ways. I don't know how to describe it quite, but it's almost like there's this pressure that's just there and it's building and it's always present. And you can't just let it go. You can't figure it out. It's like a Rubik's Cube in your soul. And it's a mess. And there's no way, and you can't put all the colors back together in the right spaces. So what you end up doing is distracting yourself with any other thing that you can find, because you have to, in order to not feel so trapped and helpless and struggling. You will gravitate towards anything you can to not feel that way. That's not peace. Peace is so hard to grasp in those situations when trauma, when those parts to your brain are just firing off and telling you that go do something. But there's a place for us to be met with God, to be met by God, to be liberated of those struggles. Whether you're somebody who just has a lot going on in life, or you're somebody who has a lot going on inside. There's a place for us to meet with God. And the first place to meet with Him, the place that will lead you to that still water where you can have peace and drink, is when you learn to trust His promises, when you learn to trust in Him. See, the difficulty of this life is that the enemy really does not want us to be at peace. See, it's at peace when we beat him. If we can feast in the midst of our enemies, if we can if we can wear him down with rest, then there's nothing he can do to us. He loses all of his edge because everything in him, so much of his power is given. Like, first off, you got to understand, like, looking at it from the macroscopic perspective, every bit of power that Satan and the demons have, not every bit, but the vast majority of their power beyond lying to you and beyond what comes as part of the nature of being an angelic being, fallen, but nevertheless, beyond being a spiritual being and and lying, all their powers given to them, like their powers, a lot of us associate them as having a lot of different types of powers. We might associate them with fire and brimstone and sickness and different things like that, but there's a lot of stuff that is given. The power that they have to begin with, any of them that have power, it's because it's been allowed by God or given to them by God. And understand me very clearly, that doesn't necessarily mean, I'm not talking about like a Job situation where God stepped back and said, do what you want. I'm talking about I'm talking about the more general thing of like where they have power because of who they are. And that's because they used to be angels. Like, they weren't stripped of their power. They weren't stripped of having certain elements of authority when they were cast down. They don't have any authority in heaven, sure. But they maintain authority over each other and over aspects of the earth. They create kingdoms, which we call principalities. They create territories and different things like that, and they'll rule over them, and they'll affect the people within them. They'll influence the people within them, I should say. But all of this is given. Everything that they have is given to them. You know, whether it's power that they had when they were angels and that was given to them by God, or power that they're given now because God allows them to have it. And a lot of the lying that they do is in order to get you to grant them permission to function at a higher level. It's weird, but it's also the way it works. Like, they have to have, it's kind of like in the old folklore about vampires, where like the way to defeat a vampire was simply to not allow them to enter your house. The old folklore about him, for those unaware, is that a vampire could only enter somebody's house if they were invited. In a similar sense, these demons, in many ways, can only do things if they're granted permission. So we find ourselves in a spot where we constantly have these spirits who are like pushing and pressuring and lying to us, and they're trying to get us to give them more opportunity, more permission, trying to believe more of their lies. And then they start lying about God, and they start lying about his goodness, and they start lying about his promises, and they start trying to turn us against him. They start trying to tell you that he's not who he says he is. Or they try to tell you that you're not good enough. Why would God protect you? Who are you to be worthy of God's protection? There are better people than you out there. You know that. You know what you did. You know who you are. You know you're not that. So they lie to you. These are the lies that they tell you. They feed you this misinformation, and then if you accept it, if you come into agreement with them, you grant them more permission, more power over you, because you're now coming in line with them. You align yourself with their ideals and their perspectives, and they fill your thoughts with more lies, with more anxiety, with more depression, with more hatred, with more fear. And the more that you agree with them, the more that they can give you. And it becomes this constant give and take until they start affecting your identity. If you're a naturally brave person, but something happens, right? Like, we'll say a car accident, just as an example. You get into a car accident, and suddenly you're a little hesitant to get behind the wheel of the car because maybe it was your fault. Or actually, more likely, it's not your fault, it's somebody else's fault. You're just the victim, right? And the enemy creeps in there, and you can drive, you're fine, but you're worried about that other people are going to crash into you because you have no control over what they do. Well, now what? What do you do with that? Well, and then the enemy starts creeping in, and he starts telling you, you shouldn't drive. You shouldn't take care of yourself this way. You should give up driving because other people are going to hurt you. And you say to yourself, well, I mean, I need to drive though. I need to get to work. And you fight with it. And you have a decision to make. Which one are you going to listen to? Well, in this occasion, just for our purpose, let's say that you agree with the demon. And out of fear, out of anxiety created by a circumstance, you come into agreement in line with what they're saying. You say, no, you know what? You're right. I should stop driving. I should take longer. I should take a break from driving until I'm more comfortable and more confident to get back on the road. I'll come back to driving when I'm confident and comfortable. So that's what you do. You take an Uber for a little while. Well, that's uncomfortable too because now you're in the control of another person. So that lasts like a day. And that's because, and even then, the enemy's in your ear every time they take like a sharp turn. They're just like, oh no, you're gonna die, and you're just like, oh no, I might actually die. And so Uber lasts a day, and then you think maybe the bus. So you take the bus, but the bus has all kinds of like suspicious people on it, and they feed you this information about, look at that person, they're looking at you. That person wants to mug you. That person wants to hurt you. And, the fear starts to continue to grow until, then you're walking because it's the only thing that you can control. But then suddenly your attention's drawn to these news articles about people being mugged in this area. And then they start to speak to you on that. And they fill your mind with all these things to be afraid of. All these possibilities, all these things where you could in fact come to harm, all these situations where you could in fact suffer, you could end up in trouble, you could end up having all these things go wrong. And you, without understanding it, you're looking at that and saying, oh my gosh, they're right. This does happen. So you agree with them. And then you agree with them, and then you agree with them, and they keep getting more hold over you, and you're giving it to them. Whether you intend to or not, you are. And that's where it starts to get really sticky. Because then suddenly you start to become a more anxious person. Where you never were before, you're suddenly rattled. And you've got anxiety. And that's something that you're carrying around now. You're anxious and suspicious and a little paranoid because fear has been able to take a hold of you. And the thing about it is that like I use this example, and there are some who might like kind of question that, but I've watched this happen in real life. I've actually seen a couple different people go through this process. It wasn't a car accident that led to it. In one case, it was an abusive husband and the divorce that they had. And after the fact, they struggled. And they struggled with trauma, and they struggled with PTSD, and they struggled with anxiety, and so many different things that they never had before that marriage. And yeah, like there was a lot that they had to unpack. There was a lot that they had to be freed of in order to start, in their own words, be a person again. But that's the thing here. That's the thing. That's the fight that we're struggling with, is to be a person. See, Paul writes in Philippians, not that one. Ah, I see. I very skillfully put my bookmark in the wrong section. In Philippians 4, Paul kind of goes to conclude his letter, and he writes some very interesting things. Now we're going to read through it. We're not going to unpack all of it, but what we're going to do is we're going to use this as an example of something here. Starting in verse 4, so Philippians 4:4. Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. Paul, in this passage, he presents a means of countering what the enemy's trying to do. And this is important because we're going to jump off of this in a lot of ways to kind of discuss this whole concept of what brings us back to peace. Because it is in the promises of God that we find peace. But we have to be able to believe them. Well, how do we believe them when the enemy, all I can think about is these things that cause me anxiety? Well, because all you're doing is thinking about the things that cause you anxiety. And I know that's a simplistic concept. But what Paul offers here, what he presents, is this thing, rejoicing in God, having this attitude of gratitude. Man, I said it. 12 years, and I've never uttered those words, and I did it. We're here. All right. Anyway, but there's this whole thing where God wants to move us is out of these places of darkness where the enemy has the ability to control us, where the enemy has the ability to kind of select the arena in which we will fight, because he's going to pick the ones where he has advantages. You know, what was it back in the battle that kept Ireland from being conquered by England entirely? It was fought. The Irish chose the battlefield, and that's what gave them the victory. You know how they did it? See, they knew that the English cavalry was too much for them. The English had knights, and the Irish did not. Irish cavalry was extremely limited. So you know what they did? They chose the battlefield. They picked the battlefield in which the battle would take place, and they set themselves up. They chose a marsh. They chose a marsh because the majority of their forces were on foot, which means they were better equipped as men on their feet to be able to handle the conditions of that terrain than a bunch of guys on horses. because the horses had less ability to control their ability to move and run and so on that marshy land. So the Irish, they chose this particular location knowing that that would be an advantage to them. And then they took trees from nearby and they created these spikes so that when the cavalry charge came, because they knew the English were not going to change their tactics. They knew the English were going to stick to what worked, what they thought would work. They weren't going to survey the situation. They weren't going to consider it. What they were going to do was they were going to act, and they were going to do their familiar strategy that had worked and what conquered them so much territory. And they did. And when they did, they found out that they couldn't stop their horses from running into the big sharpened pikes. And the Irish won the day. That is the thing. There's so many different examples that I could give you too. Like a favorite one was Hannibal Barca. In the war between Carthage and Rome. Hannibal Barca was a supreme general, and he just decimated the Romans. He's the guy who rode elephants from Spain up through the Alps into Italy, and then proceeded to take his army into the Italian mainland and fight the Romans on their own territory. Wow. One of his battles that he won, he did it because he recognized the time of day, so he arranged his forces in such a way that the sun would rise behind them, or would set behind them. That's what it was. It was later in the day, and he set them up so the sun would be setting behind his forces and would be in the eyes of the Roman soldiers. And decimated the Romans because they couldn't see. They couldn't see through the sun. The glare was too significant, and it gave Hannibal's soldiers the advantage. But that's the thing, is like, you got to understand, these are men thinking of these things. These aren't spirits that have been around since the beginning of the earth, right? They probably have a little bit more capacity in terms of their tactics. And they like to employ psychological warfare. So yeah, you're going to find situations where these spirits, they do these things. And it's not just that. There's so much chaos, and there's so much pull in life, and there's so much pressure to perform, to exist. The reality is that there's a lot here. I don't aim to make this like a message focused on demons afflicting people, but it is a big part of it. The truth is that the thing that most wants to rob you of your peace is this. But that said, in all these occasions, one of the ways that we fight this is if we can shift our focus on what is good. So, first off, Paul talks about rejoicing. Always rejoicing. You think about that and you just say, okay, well, that's kind of hard. And maybe it feels like I'm faking it till I make it and that kind of thing. And it's like, okay, sure. But what does it mean to rejoice? There's an attitude that comes with this where it's not about lying to oneself in order to make oneself a better person. That's ultimately what faking it till you make it is. You fake who you are until you become who you think you need to be. And that's not real. That's not a real thing. Inevitably, you'll slip up. Inevitably, you'll fall back into familiar patterns. Because you haven't changed. All you've done is modify your behavior. Consciously modified your behavior. No. What we're talking about is adjusting our perspective. See, the funny thing about lying to oneself is that it presupposes the idea that you are denying, you are taking false information and applying it to your situation and to your circumstance in order to deceive yourself. But what Paul's actually talking about here, when he says rejoice, and then he talks about putting your mind on good things, it's about a perspective shift. Rather than focusing on the negative, so this person in our example about the car accident, they found themselves in agreement with these demons who were presenting them with all this stuff about how they needed to be afraid. But they, at the same time, they could also have been rejoicing at the fact that they were alive. Do you understand that? Like, you can either, there were two paths laid out before them. One, being fearful that this could happen again. Or two, rejoicing in the fact that they were alive and that they were safe and that they were okay. Well, maybe they were injured, maybe they were rattled, maybe maybe they got really hurt and they lived and then they healed. And that's the thing, is like, it's not a lie to look at the other side of the coin. If it's not lying to oneself to see the silver lining and focus on that. Like, it's one thing if you begin to delude yourself. You know, I get it. But being delusional is not the same as looking at things through a different lens. Again, delusions come with lies. They come with lies that you have to tell yourself in order to maintain or create that delusion in the first place. There's no lie here. This person can be legitimately happy that they're alive, just as much as a lot of us can be legitimately happy about the things that God has given us. We sit in so many occasions where we find ourselves feeling so lacking. We feel alone. We feel hopeless. We feel like God is a million miles away. But the amazing thing about this, and I learned this so many years ago. I used to run with all these prophetic circles, and I identified as a prophet. And I found this fascinating thing. And I was so guilty of it. Bear. Mr. Bear, you okay? Okay, he's fine. You okay? You need to come up on Papa's lap? Okay, apparently we're not having a bear break. He's just staring at me. And licking his lips. I already fed him. He's had breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Anyway, but the thing about it is what I'm so guilty of this myself. I did this all the time. I would constantly be going to God for words. Because, you know, once the door was opened and I was hearing from God, all bets were off. I mean, I was just like constantly just there asking him for things, wanting information, wanting to just talk, wanting to connect with him in every way that I could. And the funny thing about that is it worked. He did it. He was so game. But the thing about it is if there was a moment of silence, I freaked out. And I would go and reach out for another word. I'd go out and reach for another thing. I'd go and I was always grabbing at him. I was always grabbing at him. Now, the reason for that, as I learned later, actually came from the deep insecurity that I was carrying around. That I was afraid that I was crazy. And more than that, I was afraid that he would abandon me. Because abandonment is one of those, like, things that has haunted me my entire life. So I was afraid that God would get tired of me, or he would decide he didn't want me around, or he would decide he was gonna leave me. So I was constantly grabbing at him in order to get him to help me feel comfortable again. It gave me a modicum of peace to connect to him, right? But the reality is that what I was so guilty of was that God would give me a word about, like, something coming up, or something that he wanted to do, or something that he was going to give me. And I would take it and I'd feel so excited about it for like an hour. And then I'd forget it. And I would be right back to him, begging him and pleading with him to tell me another word, to give me more. And sometimes on those occasions, he wouldn't. And I would flip out. My world was ending. God wasn't talking to me anymore, and oh my gosh, like, maybe he's finally gotten sick of me. Maybe he's abandoned me. Maybe I haven't been good enough. Maybe I'm not following him closely enough. Maybe I'm just like, and my mind would just get so stuck with all these invasive, intrusive thoughts about him and his character and whether he loved me and all this stuff. But in retrospect, what it was that I was struggling with so much was that I didn't trust him. I didn't believe that he loved me. I barely understood what it was to be loved. I mean, I've talked enough in past messages. If you watch the last like 8 messages or so, you'll find me talking about my parents and like getting abandoned at an early age. So we're not going to spend time on that right now, but it's there. Like, I have wounds that I was carrying. And therein lies the thing that I was projecting all those things onto God. And the enemy, of course, was so gentle about it that he would constantly push me into those places, and then I'd start agreeing with them and believing that God had abandoned me and turned on me and all these different things, and then God would have to eventually come back and just be like, bruh, what is wrong with you? And he was never so blunt, but what he would say was very literally like, I'm not gonna leave you. I'm not gonna leave you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. That's what he told Joshua. Chapter 1 of the book of Joshua is Joshua talking to God and God telling him that just as he led Moses, or was with Moses, he would be with Joshua. And he says the line, "Never will I leave you, nor will I forsake you." He made a promise to Joshua in that moment. Then in chapter 13 of Hebrews, verse 5, the writer of Hebrews repeats that line. He says, I'm paraphrasing, but keep your lives free and don't love money. Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God has said, "Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you." So we say with confidence, "The Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me?" Never will I leave you and never will I forsake you is a promise that he made. And it's a promise that he's kept. He kept it to Joshua, but he kept it to Israel. And he's kept it to us even after. We even for those of us who don't have the blood of the chosen ones in our bloodline, we Gentiles, we're grafted in as his children. We're grafted into that same stuff, and in that adoption, that promise applies to us just as much as anybody else. So while it's easy for us to fall into feeling alone, especially when God's quiet, or he doesn't answer our prayers immediately, or when he doesn't talk to us the way that we want him to talk to us, we start falling into this realm of thinking that he's abandoned us. We start thinking that he's not there, but there's a promise that he's made. And there's a promise, and it is a promise that he will keep. See, the thing that I learned in that time when I was struggling with those words was just how fatalistic I really was in the way that I thought about myself and the way that I thought about God. I learned that my faith was not faith. I knew God would talk to me. I knew that God was there. But I didn't believe in him. I didn't trust him. One of the struggles that a lot of us have with relationships is that we have bad relationships. And when potential good relationships show up, we're so afraid of repeating the bad that we watch our new partners for any kind of red flag, any kind of thing that would indicate that we're going to be repeating the same mistake, because some of us have a type. Some of us have a nasty tendency to pick men or women that are a lot like our parents, for better or worse. Usually, if we're looking out for it, it's for the worse. Sometimes we have a type that we find ourselves drawn to and we can't explain it. I knew more than a few women who were just in love with douchebags, and they just couldn't get enough of them. They thought they were going to fix them, and it never happened. They just got really, really hurt. But that's the thing, is that they were so busy, and then they'd carry on the wounds from those relationships into the next relationship. And there'd be times when they would project their exes onto their new partners. And even when they had a really good one, they couldn't see him, because the shadow of those before was so big and so deep that they couldn't let it go. We project so much onto God, whether it's our parents, lovers, lies that we've been told about life. You know how many people believe that that God wants to send them to hell. Like, a lot of us believe that we have this weird mentality. You'll find it especially if you like go out into the world. Um, a lot of atheists, for example, believe that we believe that we have to earn our way into heaven by being good. It's not even remotely true. You don't earn your way into heaven. You are adopted into heaven. It's not by earning. You can be an absolute jerk of a person and still potentially go to heaven. You can be the sweetest, most gentle soul and still potentially go to hell. It seems wrong, but it all comes down to sonship, being a child of God.
Yeah.
It's not about you hitting some mark of perfection. It's about you being His. Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you, is something that God says and He means for those who choose Him. But it's more than that. He'll choose people from an early age. There's a pastor we were just listening to speak, a very influential prophet, and he was talking about how his first encounter with Jesus was when he was 6 years old. One of my first encounters with God revealing Himself to be there was when I was like 5, maybe. I might have been 4. It was but anyway, I won't get into that. This message is already going a little longer. But that's the thing, is that like there are places where God will absolutely show Himself to us. And you might say to yourself, well, He didn't do that for me. Not yet. Maybe not yet. And maybe it's just a place of like being open to Him. You know, we've had so many different situations and different people come through this group. This group's been around since 2014. Even though it's kind of like at a low end here, it's been ages. We've had so many different people come through and so many different things. And the reality is that so often we're struggling with the same issues. It's funny in a way in that like trauma creates pathways in your brain that tell you how things are. It's just like the projection that we do in a relationship. It's just like the development of that fear stuff over time. It's just a little harder. Like it's more damaging in a way. But it's a lie that we believe. But it's an experience, right? That's what makes trauma. Is that we've had the experience, and it was so bad that our brain has developed a way to never let us experience it again. Or at least it's going to try to keep us from experiencing it again. In all these things, though, there's a place for us to look at things this other way. Because see, it's almost like the way that your brain has like engraved that thing in there. There's a place for us to have it engraved into us that we can have absolute faith in God. See, it's the same kind of way that like when you're a child, you look at your authority figures as being like with the faith of a child, which is the kind of thing where it's like, you know, you go to school and your teacher tells you that the earth is round, and then you go home and dad says the earth is flat. You trust dad. You absolutely trust dad. Dad knows what he's talking about because you know him. There is no question. There is no doubt. There is purely the fact, the word of your father, and you know after you're 4, 5, or how old are kids when they're in like first grade?
Like 6 and 7.
6 and 7. You got 6 to 7 years of development that tell you that your dad is the smartest person that you know. And if he says something, he's right. Because he's been right so many times in your life. And there's no reason for you to doubt him. Till your teacher comes with the pictures of the world. But that's for another thing. The reality here, though, is that there's this place for us to have this kind of faith in God. And the difference is, God's not going to tell you the world's flat unless it's actually flat, which it's not. Sorry. Spoiler. But the thing about it is there's a place for us to have that kind of faith, to have that kind of reaction to God. And it comes from this place of like, sometimes we have to go back, and we have to be willing to kind of look back at who we're supposed to be and who he says we're going to be, and just what he says in general, because the promises that are there are huge. Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. One of the most greatest struggles that we have is loneliness. We're social creatures, and when we get to feeling isolated or alone, it messes with us. It screws with our minds.
Yeah.
But we're never really alone with him. We always have him right there. But we're so focused on being alone, we're so focused on being isolated, that we're not paying attention to him being in the room with us. He lives in you. A couple of other promises he gave me to highlight. Not Matthew 23. The truth of the matter is that we could, even just like trying to find this.
You want me to find one?
Yeah.
Okay.
I thought I knew where it was, but I'm like
It's okay.
spacing it.
What's the part you remember of it?
It's the part about how he will he'll give us rest.
Oh, okay.
All you who are weary, come to me and know that my yoke is light and my burden is easy, and you will find rest.
Matthew 11:28.
No. I was way off. Okay. Oh, for whatever reason, I had it in my head as a very, very different verse. This is a promise. Matthew 11, starting in verse 28. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Jesus says this, and that didn't change. That promise is still sitting there. It's still for us. These are the things that we're meant to hold on to. When Paul talks about this thing of like holding on to what is good and what is holy, if you can stop and think for a moment about the things that God has done for you in your life, and I'm not talking about the things that you just grab at, because that's something that we do. We'll try to get into that gratitude, and we'll just be like, well, I'm alive, I have air to breathe, I have food to eat. No. Those things are great, that's cool, but that's such low-hanging fruit. Think of what he has personally done for you. Do you have a good spouse? I do. I thank God for that every day.
Mine's better.
No, mine's better.
No, mine.
Anyway, she's wrong. The thing about it is, do you have a good partner? Do you have good friends? Do you have a fantastic job? Do you have people who love you? Do you feel loved? Do you feel safe? Do you feel confident in life? Do you not struggle with anxiety? It's like one of the most common mental disorders in our country. If you don't have it, rejoice, you have been saved. The thing about it is that we have so much. And if God has made promises to you and kept them, keep those. Hold on to those. Treasure those things. Don't let them go. They can save you. When the enemy comes knocking at your door with lies to tell you, do you know how you beat him half the time? You want to know how you start with it? Because I could show you how to cast off demons and, stand in the authority of Jesus to make them leave and different things like that. But do you remember what Jesus did when the devil came lying to him? He told him he was wrong. Granted, that didn't make him leave. It was when Jesus told him to leave is when he left. But
Well, he
prior
also quoted the truth.
but prior to that, every time Satan would come with a lie, Jesus would respond with the truth. And you know what the devil had to do with that? Nothing. He had nothing to do. All he could do was go and try to regroup and come up with a new plan. Because he'd just been quashed. And that's the thing. That's the thing. There's so much. Every time that you open up the Bible, read the words of Jesus. I found 5 different promises just opening up to that passage. Where he talks about those who choose to follow him and leave their mothers and fathers and who have lost family and been abandoned, they will find eternal life. One of the most important passages to me myself is Revelation 3:21. To him who overcomes, I will give the right to sit with me on my throne, just as my Father gave me the right to sit with him on his throne. To him who has ears, let him hear.
Spirit says to the churches.
What the Spirit says to the churches. And in this, hear me. The promises that lead us to peace are the promises that we hold on to, that we treasure, that we believe in, that we accept as true. Because the thing about it is as long as we are following God but not believing in Him, we will always find chaos. We will always find strife. We have to come to places to surrender who we are, to surrender what we know. You know, I spent the early portion of this message talking about trauma, talking about PTSD, talking about these like soldiers and so on, and just kind of like the behaviors that they had. Because everything was chaos for them. They needed to do something with their hands to occupy themselves so they weren't left with their minds and their hearts. And so many of us do that. We'll feel like there are some of us where, yes, life is absolute chaos. Like our entire situation, maybe it's our families who are just insane and they're always doing something. You know, so-and-so shot so-and-so with a nail out of their BB gun again. Why did they put a nail in their BB gun? I don't know, but they did it, and then they shot somebody with it, and now they got a nail in them. So-and-so lit somebody's yard on fire because they were playing with a paper plate and a lighter. So-and-so's peeing out of the window again, and they've peed on the dog. You know, I'm literally quoting life for that I grew up with. I'm not going to name names, but it happened. And those who know, they know. Oh, I'm sitting in my room and I'm hearing wrestling going on in the room outside my bedroom, and I'm sitting on my computer and I'm like, God, really? We got another wrestling match? And then suddenly I hear the eternal words, I'm going to pee on you. And I'm like, huh. And then all of a sudden I hear the other person screaming, oh, it's warm. That happened. The thing of it is yes, some of us have situations where our families are crazy, or our friends are crazy, or our jobs are crazy, and we don't have any control over that, and we feel swept up in the mess of it, right? But then there's others of us who create that chaos by keeping ourselves busy to the point of exhaustion, because we're so busy trying to run away from our own feelings. That happens too. And we might blame the world around us. But if you're throwing yourself into a fire, if you fall into a fire, you have no one to blame. But if you jump into that fire, you do have somebody to blame. You can't blame the fire for burning you. You can blame yourself for diving into it, though. And that's the thing, is that at no point in time should any of this be an issue that we have to struggle with, because there's a place for us to have that something that needs to be satisfied. There's water for us to receive from God. The water that would make us never thirst again. A promise that He offered. Jesus said that His flesh was real food, that His blood was real drink. And, you know, take that as you may, but what He was saying was He was life. He has the ability to nourish us every day with just who He is. There's a promise in that. And the reality is, most of us have experiences where God has shown us that He's there. And if you haven't had experiences where God has shown you that He's there, well, then there's an opportunity. There's an opportunity for you to meet Him. See, I listen to a lot of I listen to a lot of atheists talk about Christianity. And I'm bewildered sometimes by how little they know. And that's not a shot. It's more just kind of an observation. I've got some of them that I watch are like they majored in religion. You know, they spent years of study in college reading the Bible and learning about different things, but they can't remember really simplistic details about Jesus's life and things that he said because it doesn't matter to them. They're just up. They're just kind of an observer looking at this thing. But the thing about it is that like for those who have not had those experiences with God to see that he's there and that he's real, there's opportunity there to be met. We had a guy in our group who was atheist for a minute, and I mean, he didn't leave a Christian, but he didn't leave an atheist either. But no, God absolutely started to meet him while he was here. You know, I had a vision that I shared with him, and then another friend of his had sent him this picture that she drew, and we were completely independent of each other. And he's just like, how did this happen? I'm like, 'cause God, man. Like, I told you at the outset things were going to start getting weird. And they did. They did. Because we've always been the kinds of people, this group has always been the kind of group where we're open to having God move however he's going to move. Whether that's through prophecy or healing or deliverance or any kind of thing that's there, it's there. You know, we're not like crazy about it. I've never really had access to people who can do worship. I've had like one person come through who was like solidly willing to do worship sessions for our group. And that didn't last long for assorted reasons. But the thing about it was that we've always kind of worked within what we had. And in a lot of those occasions, it's just God doing stuff. And when he does stuff, and it's fun. Hilarious and fun. And for somebody with that kind of perspective of their experience is them, how did he phrase it?
Suspending disbelief.
Thank you. Suspending his disbelief. So he suspends his disbelief, and then suddenly God starts doing stuff with him. You know, whether it's pictures and of whether he's getting multiple pictures of God showing him aspects of his identity, or he's like getting things put on his heart and then gets the Bible scripture after the fact given to him by one of the group prophets that confirms what he's doing while he's doing it. Ah, it's so fun. It was so fun to watch. And the reality is that it's just that. Like, God said, never will I leave you and never will I forsake you. And he meant it. And we all have that ability to draw into that. And I think, you know, even though there's like a million different promises that I can go grab and we can look at, we can go read John 17 and read his prayers and read his promises for his disciples and for us. We could read John 15 where he talks about how, you know, it's for the fulfillment of his joy and our joy that he gives us, that we are given whatever we want as long as it's in his name. You know, there's so many different parts where the Father wanting to give us his kingdom. His whole kingdom. He wants us to be like part of that. Part of it. And in places of leadership. Like, it's so crazy. It's actually crazy in some ways, but they're all promises. They're all things that God has said. Because he wants us there. And we're so busy believing in our own anxieties and insecurities that he says, hey, if you overcome, I'll give you the right to sit with me on my throne. And we say, oh, well, it's a shame I'll never overcome. That's you making a decision. You've made a judgment on yourself at that point. You've come into agreement with things that you didn't even know you were coming into agreement with in order to stymie your own progress. The promise is that if you overcome, you receive this thing. And you know what you have to do to overcome? Follow him. That's it. That's it. Because his yoke is easy and his burden is light. We need to stop spending our time coming into agreement with the enemy and forsaking the promises of God in order to believe the circumstances of our experiences. If God says that he's never going to leave you or forsake you, don't believe it when your own brain starts telling you that he's abandoned you. Just because you haven't heard from him or because you haven't experienced him in some certain way. I've had prophets come to me and feel like they weren't prophets because God didn't speak to them. Instead, he showed them visions and spoke with them through dreams. And I remember just sitting there with that person, and it's not even the first one, there's been multiple people, but I remember sitting there with them as they told me that. I'm just like, he is speaking to you. He's speaking to you exactly in the way that you would receive it the most. Because he knows how to speak to us. He knows our hearts. He knows our persons. He knows how we learn and how we best function. And he loves us. And that's a promise. Like there's so many different promises meant to that can draw us into peace, because if we can accept that he loves us, if we can accept that he's there with us, that we're never alone. If you're never alone, when do you have to feel afraid? When do you have to feel abandoned? When do you have to feel isolated? Well, you don't, because you're never alone. If you're loved, when do you have to feel unwanted? Well, if somebody loves you, can they not want you? Maybe for a moment, but no, not really. The reality is that there's just the promises that we're meant to hold on to are meant to be a source of power and in that a source of peace. When Paul finishes that statement with, "And the God of peace will be with you," he's stating a fact about how God, who is the God of peace, will then come and be with you as a person. He will be with you and linger with you. Because he loves you, and he wants you, and he delights in you. And the promise here is that he'll always be there for you. If you want him. And that's the thing. If you can stand in his love, knowing that you're wanted, everywhere you go, you'll be loved and wanted. And that's a big deal. It's a big deal. That allows us a situation to be unapologetically ourselves. To be completely solidly who we are, despite whatever's going on around us. And in the end, that's one of the things. God loves you for who you are. He wants you for who you are. So yeah, that's what I got.